You're listening to episode 67 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Scott Edelstein speaks with us about his book, Sex and the Spiritual Teacher, Why It Happens, When It's a Problem, and What We All Can Do. Physical relationships between teachers and students is not a particularly new occurrence. It happens, perhaps more than we know. In certain situations, there are factors making it clearly inappropriate. In others, the lines may not be so very clear, as we sometimes see with voluntary student-teacher roles between adults in meditation centers. Events of the past 30 years of the unskillful variety have caused tremendous suffering to those involved, rippling outward to harm those who may not even have been aware of the relationships. Some centers have recognized the risks and have taken steps in the right direction by providing clear guidelines for students and teachers alike. Others are still in a state of shock over some very recent behaviors, and it is hoped that healing can begin. Scott Edelstein has studied happily and productively with several spiritual teachers, including Tony Packer, Dinan Katagiri, Tim McCarthy, and Steve Hagen, who will be our guest in a couple of weeks. He is a longtime practitioner of both Buddhism and Judaism, and a committed proponent of serious spirituality in all forms and traditions. Scott's short work on spiritual topics has appeared in Shambhala Sun, American Jewish World, The Writer, the anthology What About God, and elsewhere. He is the author of 15 books on a wide variety of subjects. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice, sweet tea in honor of some friends in Atlanta. And our guest today is Scott Edelstein. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Very glad to be here, Ted.
I had the unusual opportunity of actually meeting you, and I'm kind of surprised we hadn't run into each other before. As, I want to tell the listeners that what we're here to speak about is Scott's book, Sex and the Spiritual Teacher, a new book that just came out, and Scott, you gave a talk about this at the Minnesota Zen Meditation Center, which was my starting place for Buddhism. And so we had a chance to chat for a little bit afterwards, and it was really terrific to meet you and get my copy of the book. Everyone listening, this is the sound of my copy of the book. And what I'd like you to do, Scott, is just talk for a few minutes about how you first encountered Buddhism.
My first formal encounter with Buddhism was when I was a college student. I was, I think 19 years old. I was at Oberlin College. And I'd been interested for, I'd say, about a year, maybe 2 years in things spiritual, although I'm not sure I understood what things spiritual meant. I had read the book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. And actually now that I'm 56, I know even less what the terms things spiritual mean. When somebody uses the word spirituality, I ask them to define it. Because it means so many different things to so many people. But back when I was 19, I got to Oberlin, and there was a class called Zen Meditation. And it was through what Oberlin had, and maybe still has, called the Experimental College, where they offer some non-traditional courses, some taught by faculty, some taught by students. And it was taught by a fellow student who was 1 year older than me. His name was Tim McCarthy. And he gave a great introduction to it, and it got me interested. I kept sitting meditation and reading long after that initial class. Tim later went on to become one of Kobuchino's students, and then to be one of his successors, and he now runs the Kent Zendo in Kent, Ohio. And he's probably best known, he's mostly under the radar, but if you read Brad Warner's books, he appears in, I believe, all of Brad's books. And Brad is pretty accurate. The Brad Warner who narrates Brad Warner's books is partly fictionalized. And it's not that the events didn't happen. The events happened, but the voice that he uses is far more in your face than the actual Brad Warner. And in fact, when I was living in Kent many years later, Brad showed up. He was 19 or 20 at the time, and actually very soft-spoken, very talented, very friendly person. But the way that Brad portrays Tim is quite accurate. Very non-traditional, very, very open and friendly, makes jokes, puts, stuffed toys on the altar, all kinds of such things. And so when I was about to graduate college, I asked Tim, well, where would you recommend that I go if I want to study Zen or Buddhism seriously? And he recommended two places, Los Angeles Zen Center, where Maizumi Roshi was, and the Minnesota Zen Center, where Katagiri was. In retrospect, intriguingly, I would have run across somewhat similar scandals going to either one of these.
Yeah.
Although certainly the range, the scope, the scale of it with Maizumi was much, much, much larger than with Katagiri. So I decided to go to Minnesota. At the time, I was actually a finalist for a screenwriting fellowship, and I figured if I got it, I'd go to L.A., and if I didn't, I would go to Minneapolis. And I didn't get it, and that's how I wound up there. And then over the years, I wound up in other parts of the country, so I studied with Tony Packer for a while, found my way back to Kent, Ohio for a couple of years, and sat with Tim McCarthy again at his Zendo, and then was down with Kobuchino in New Mexico for a year. And and I'm very glad to be back in Minneapolis, where I've been almost over 20 years again now, and I've been studying with Steve Hagen, who's also a longtime friend, and I'm his editor and literary agent. So that's the kind of quick and dirty version.
Now, speaking of your background as a literary agent, you had, I believe you were also involved in the production of a book on Katagiri Roshi. Is that correct? Am I remembering that right? Andrea's book?
Well, I was the agent for two of Katagiri's books. Not the first one, which actually Natalie Goldberg arranged with Shambhala. And then the next two, I was brought in to be the agent. I also did some editing on You Have to Say Something, Katagiri's second book. But I've been an agent for lots of different books, and for a number of Katagiri's students, for a number of Buddhist writers, and of course for lots of non-Buddhist writers.
So the book we're talking about today, Sex and the Spiritual Teacher, and the subtitle on this, I should list for people, is Why It Happens, When It's a Problem, and What We All Can Do. Tell us about what led you to writing this book and what your approach to the topic is.
Part of being a professional writer is you look at things and look for things that the world needs, that aren't being addressed. And so it's a routine thing that I do when I go, the world needs this, and then I go and search to see if the this that the world needs is out there.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is. And then it's actually a big relief. I wipe my brow and go, well, that's another thing I don't have to do.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one stream. And I saw, of course, that these sexual encounters between teachers and students, and the harmful ones, the ones that would say what you want, created karma, caused problems, that they were continuing, and we'd improved a little bit since the first survey on them was taken by Jack Kornfield back in the 1980s, in which over 65% of the teachers surveyed and over 85% of the non-celibate teachers surveyed said they'd had sex with at least one of their students. So things have improved somewhat, but it's the situation was not changing, but more notably, the discourse was not changing. It was still all falling into a half dozen standard patterns. One of which was when such a thing is revealed to sort of chop the teacher to bits and make the teacher into a villain. The other is to circle around the teacher and try to squelch it, all of the Catholic Church. And of course, this happens in every religion, every denomination. The third is to deny it. And then there's a bunch of other standard takes, and I list some of them in my book. One is that these are very rare problems. It's a very small number of teachers with psychological problems. And that's not the case. All the surveys of all helping professionals, including spiritual teachers and ordinary clergy, anywhere between 10 and 30%, certainly of the men, much smaller percentage of the women, get sexually involved with their students or clients. And I get reports regularly from people because I have this website now to support the book. People tell me their stories. So that was ongoing. And there's some other common takes that are also just that do not adequately explain it. So one is that it's just a handful of problems, a handful of bad apples. Another is that men are pigs and they just can't keep their pants zipped up. That what do you expect? Well, if that's the case, then why is it 10 to 30% and not 100% of
right.
men or 80% of men? The next kind of standard take is that it's all about power. It's not really about sex. Well, then why is it that some of these encounters are totally romantic and it seem to have nothing to do with power? Another is that these are actually consenting relationships and we should all back off. So, and all of these just put us back in the same position. They keep us from actually looking honestly and clearly at what the real issues are. And so I said, okay, somebody's got to do it, and I guess it's going to be me. Now, there's another stream that created this book, and that was my assistant, Alice Erickson, who was the administrator at the Minnesota Zen Center.
Yeah, Alice was a dear friend of mine when I first started going to the Zen Center in the early 90s. My first encounter there was with Dokai Georgeson. To people who don't know, when I'm this Midwestern guy, I show up at this place to wonder about meditation, and this bald guy in robes greets me, which is a little startling. But he was very inviting. He's actually one of my favorite speakers, and it took a bit to get over that hurdle. But who helped with that most was Alice Erickson. She was terrific to speak with and spend time with at Zen Center, and she really contributed very positively towards creating a welcoming atmosphere there.
I think she was exactly the right person for the job, and a big part of me would say it was not a smart decision on the Zen Center's part to let her go. The only reason that I wouldn't agree with myself on that 100% is that Zen Center's loss was my gain.
Yep.
When they let her go, it was just because they were balancing the budget, and they said they had to cut something, and that's what they decided to cut.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think she was out on the street a week when I found out, and I said, "You want to come work for me?" And she said, "Yes." And so she was my professional assistant, and even did a little personal assistance, running errands and things like that. And when she showed up, she had an idea for a book like this. And I was a literary agent, I still am, but was much more active in it back then. And I said, what a great idea, go for it. And a couple of years passed, and she really didn't do anything with it. And, I'm not dissing Alice, it's just she had initially planned to do it, and just as often happens, the project just didn't get very far in her hands.
Yeah, and Alice was coming out of that time period when things were first coming to light. And exactly. It was a very difficult time at Minnesota Zen Meditation Center. And other centers have been going through that as well. So I remember that time very clearly, and it was rough on everybody. It
was indeed. And so when she finally said, you know what, I'm not going to do this, and I saw the same stuff happening over and over and over, and certainly not just in Zen, not just in Buddhism, I see it happening really every denomination of every religion. And the parallels, I almost dare not call them parallels because they're more similar than that. They're everywhere. And I said, okay, let's see if I can do something to nudge this discourse in a more useful way, and maybe reduce the karma, increase the safety, reduce the exploitation. And the other thing I wanted to do was make some separations. It's not that sex between a spiritual teacher and a student is always and invariably wrong. That's another one of the standard takes. That would mean, for example, that Steve Hagen, his wife Jean, died about a year ago. But that would mean, for example, that when Steve became a spiritual teacher, he was already married to Jean, that she would have to say, no, I refuse to learn a single thing from you,
right.
Or she would have to divorce him if she wanted to. And so, that's one classic example of where it isn't always wrong. In that case, you're building, they were together, and I'm not singling out Steve and Jean. There's lots of couples like this. They build the teacher-student relationship on top of an existing equal relationship. Yeah, there's difficulties and problems, and not everybody can manage it, but it's not inherently exploitive, and it can work, and it did in Steve and Jean's case. And there are other examples, too. Somebody wrote me the story. He was a Tai Chi teacher, and he was teaching a Tai Chi class at some community education program through the public schools, and he had a student, and they, there was clearly some attraction. And so they talked about it, and they got together and were very transparent about it. Well, the big problems with these teacher-student romances are, number one, the potential role confusion, where you have somebody who's both your equal and your kind of spiritual superior, and then that power differential. But there's not a lot of power differential between if you're a student of a Tai Chi teacher, and you're just taking this once-a-week class at a community education center, I guess theoretically there's a tiny power differential, but not much. And so there I would say I just don't think it's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talked a bit about that exact topic, the power differential, during your talk the other night, that we have situations like the one where you just described, where looking at the whole context of the situation, the power differential kind of small, and the risk of abuse is correspondingly kind of small. That is a very different circumstance that we have in other situations where you have a figurehead whose will must not be questioned, what says is the religious law, and to every wife he has or every interest he has or he or she has, there is a much greater power differential because the person who is on the lower end of that scale doesn't have any choice. Sometimes they're not even able to leave that place without great logistic physical help to physically get away from it. So I think one of the really good points that you brought up the other night, and I believe this is in the book, is that power differential makes a big difference, and we need to look at the entire situation comprehensively, not just automatic knee-jerk, no, that's wrong, or automatic knee-jerk, no, that's none of our business. Let's take a look. Let's see what the situation is.
Yeah, it is all on a case-by-case basis. One of the reasons that this becomes such a problem, and there is so much exploitation in the two streams in Buddhism, I would note in particular, are Zen and Tibetan Buddhism. And that's where the power differential is the greatest. The teacher may not necessarily be put on a pedestal, but they work very closely and carefully one-on-one with students. There's a great deal of spiritual intimacy, a great deal of trust, all of which are good things, a great deal of vulnerability. But that also means a great deal of potential for exploitation and abuse. And the more the student looks up to a teacher, the more tempting it is for both of them to cross those boundaries, and the more potential damage can be done. When you compare that with, say, the insight meditation people, when Jack Kornfield and Joseph Goldstein and oh my God, my mind is going blank. Sharon Salzberg. Sharon Salzberg kind of brought that Theravadan tradition to America and somewhat Americanized it. one of the things that they did, which was very wise, I mean, it has its own drawbacks too, because everything has its drawbacks, but one of the wise things they did was to really reduce that power differential. A teacher in the IMS tradition, as it were, it's a pretty young tradition, is almost like a slightly older brother or sister. They're not revered. They're not made into something special. They don't wear special clothes. They just go through a teacher training program, and it's almost like getting your certification as a nurse.
Yeah, and they go by their regular names, and they're having seen this in practice, it's very, very westernized, I think, compared to a traditional Theravada practice, which is all robes, bhante, respectful, bow 3 times, and many traditional Theravadins, many monastics are sort of setting aside the forms for their Western people, though we see, say, the Sri Lankans will still very much act on those forms because it's part of the culture, and that's fine. That's perfectly okay. But IMS has done a really nice job of providing a more welcoming atmosphere to Westerners in that they're not going by Roshi and Master and this and that, and it's this is Joseph, this is Sharon.
And as a result, or as one result, there's very little sexual exploitation or abuse in that stream. But having said that, there's a downside to that, and I'm not dissing them for this. There's a downside whenever you do anything. But that is, there's also often less intimacy, less trust, at least in the short term. Maybe over the long term it grows. And less of a sense that this person can really see deep inside your head, your heart, and your gut than is in the case with Tibetan Buddhism and Zen. Now, I'm going to turn that around and say often that sense we have that this person can see that deeply in Tibetan Buddhism and Zen is misguided. We are projecting that onto them, and they don't see us that deeply. But every choice you make, there are potential consequences for good and for ill.
So one of the things we chatted about during the talk, and it's very clear from that conversation, from looking at the book, that this is not what we would call an exposé, where you talk about the detailed history of events of sexual questionable behavior, shall we say, in the tradition. That's not what this is.
Right. It's not finger pointing or finger wagging.
Right. You're making. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say, though, that there are 2 case histories I provide, and they're of 2 organizations where they had very charismatic, sexually exploitive leaders, booted those leaders out, and have managed to reinvent themselves, and have been quite public about what happened. And those are San Francisco Zen Center, and they booted out Richard Baker, and Kripalu, which was a yoga ashram and now is just called the Kripalu Center for Yoga, up in the I believe it's in the Berkshires.
Berkshires, I think. Yeah,
it's in the Berkshires. And so there's a chapter showing just how it's possible to reinvent yourself as an organization. And because those were very public stories, I wanted to present them.
And you do that, and it's in the context of what I'm very happy about with this book is that the entire part 2 really is about, and here's what we can do. It's more so about not these past-looking historical events. It's the forward-thinking, part 2 even called Cultivating Trust and Reducing Exploitation. It's where do we go from here? And you include in this, towards the end, an open letter to spiritual teachers, further questions, and an afterword by Anne Catherine on knowledge, action, and power. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you present in your book about, for example, one of the things that stood out for me was why codes, policies, and therapies aren't always enough.
Yeah, well, the whole second part is about what we can do as communities, not just as individuals. The whole first part is about what we can do as individuals. And part of what the whole book is built on is that there are no magic bullets where you do one thing and everything's going to get better. That's naive, it's foolish, and it actually just enables more of the same. But what we need to do as individuals is, number one, stay more attentive to our own hearts, minds, and guts, listen to our own perceptions, speak up when anything seems amiss, be both, well, in Zen you know the phrase about great faith and great doubt. Bring both to any relationship with a spiritual teacher. Yes, go in with faith, but also as soon as there might be a problem, be willing to exercise that doubt and step back. Be willing to say no, be willing to challenge the teacher, all those sorts of individual things. Be willing to leave. Zen has a huge tradition of students leaving their teachers. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can do as individuals. In the second part, there's a chapter on what communities can do. There's a chapter about the hiring of spiritual teachers. There's a chapter on the training of spiritual teachers. There's a chapter on providing support systems, everything from a live hotline to a review board to and interestingly enough, in American Buddhism, there are very few review boards. So if somebody is feeling like they've been mistreated within their congregation or sangha, and they go to the leaders, and the leaders just basically say, no, we're not paying attention to you, or we're going to deny it, or we're going to protect the exploiter, or whatever, they have nowhere to go. So we also need a kind of higher authority. Now that has its own set of problems. In Orthodox Judaism, there's the Orthodox Union, which is supposed to do exactly that for Orthodox congregations. And it has at times, instead of advocating for the congregant, they've protected the teacher. But, anything can go astray, anything can go wrong if it's not done carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I think it's very, one of the best things about the book is that it does not take what a different tradition, not our own, goes into, which is if someone is caught doing something really, really very wrong in a criminal sexual misconduct kind of way, we don't move them somewhere else so they can repeat the behavior into something. That's not okay. And in some relationships, which can be exploitive, as you described, this is not solved by hiding away from it. This is not solved by turning aside and not recognizing that there's a problem that is revealed and addressed only when we don't shy away from it. And this is our practice in meditation, is not shying away from what's going on, even in our own minds. So we shouldn't shy away from this. We should be able to, I keep using this phrase, so everybody repeat it with me, question with confidence. We need to be able to do that. It's the only way things like this can positively be changed.
The other thing that I think is important is to note that when you have these intimate one-to-one spiritual relationships, and that's why I wrote a book specifically about spiritual teachers. I mean, there's lots and lots of books about ordinary clergy that sexually go astray. But there's a unique difference with spiritual teachers because of that one-to-one intimacy. Someone who just goes up and talks, someone like Eckhart Tolle, and I'm not dissing Tolle, it's just that he doesn't work one-on-one with people. He did, I think, many years ago, but now he's very well known, and it would make sense for him to be just giving talks. So it's not that he doesn't deserve to call himself a spiritual teacher, but just by my definition for this book, he wouldn't be a spiritual teacher because he doesn't work one-on-one with folks. So, maybe Eckhart Tolle, now he has a partner, I believe, so I'm being totally hypothetical here. But if you were to go, someone were to go to see him speak, and you go, oh, he's so wise, he's so wonderful, I am hot for him. And they and Tolle were to get together, there wouldn't be a problem. Unless one of them was already committed to someone else. But, if they were both single, it's just like meeting a rock star, right? Because they don't already have that intimate one-to-one spiritual relationship, there's no real problem. Yes, of course, there's the potential problem of projecting all kinds of wisdom on him that he might not have, or you're putting him on a pedestal. All those things are, of course, possible, but people can do that in any romantic relationship.
Yeah.
So that's, I just don't think that's an issue. But when you have this one-to-one stuff going on, and that person is essentially deep inside your heart, that's where the problem begins. So I make a variety of distinctions, because there are folks out there, and the other distinction I actually make is we needn't be prudish, we needn't be priggish, and we shouldn't be anti-sex. We shouldn't expect, I encourage people to have great sex lives in this book, unless they vowed celibacy, of course. And we should let our teachers have great sex lives. And we should not try to tamp down that sexual energy. And in fact, I would argue even if you're celibate, you shouldn't be trying to tamp down that sexual energy. So that there are many different distinctions that I think need to be made because people lump all this together. And it's difficult when you've got, say, the prudes and prigs on one side who would love to just wag their fingers and make everybody sexless. That's not going to do it, and that does nobody any good. People can choose to be celibate, that's fine.
We've seen mandated celibacy doesn't do so well in other traditions. No. It's like abstinence-based sex education. Really? That's proof that doesn't really work so well. Scott, you've got a couple of websites that I wanted to give you a chance to chat about. There's your own and another for the book. Why don't you tell us more about those?
Sure. Well, the site for the book, which is sexandthespiritualteacher.com, it's got excerpts from the book. It's got interviews with me. It's going to have, starting in a few weeks, and I'm saying this now in mid-April of 2011, there'll be dialogues, interviews, and debates about once every 3 weeks with a variety of other writers, of spiritual teachers, and so on topics relevant to the book. And those will probably start, I'm guessing, sometime in early May. And then there'll be other things as appropriate. There's also, of course, a list of upcoming events. I'm doing a book tour for the book, so there's places I'll be speaking. You can listen in to radio interviews I've done, things like that. Ultimately, a second site will go up called the Spiritual Teacher site. Right now, if you type that in, you go to Sex and the Spiritual Teacher. But I'm doing a follow-up book that will be published in late 2012 called Breathe, Listen, Learn, a practical guide for anyone who wants or already has a spiritual teacher. And that's more of a kind of, for lack of a better term, a user's guide for for people who want to have or already have a spiritual teacher. And that will cover all the issues about not just boundaries, but being a student, what to expect, what not to expect, what are the red flags, and so on. And so then I'll expand they'll have a whole separate site that will look not just at these issues of sexual exploitation and errancy and such, but at everything having to do with these relationships. By these, I mean the spiritual relationships between teachers and students.
I hope you'll come back and speak with us when that book just comes out, because I'd love to chat with you about that again as well.
I'd be very happy to.
Everyone, we've been speaking with Scott Edelstein. The book that we've been talking about today is Sex and the Spiritual Teacher. I do recommend taking a look at the book and getting it. Is available on the episode page for this episode, and you can always go directly to Amazon and go find it yourself. And take a look at the website as well, sexandthespiritualteacher.com. I think you'll find, particularly when this podcast comes out, the discussion should be going at that point. And I'm looking forward to seeing, because you do have on there some of the stories that people have about their experiences, I think positive and negative, on the topic. So everyone, please go check that out. Scott, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. I look forward to coming back.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on the Secular Buddhist.